Cuando yo estaba pequeño, mis maestros me decían que el agua era un recurso inagotable. Y de forma coherente con esto, recuerdo, no con cierta culpa, no sin cierta culpa, cuando yo primero abría la ducha y luego me preparaba para ducharme, dejando correr el agua y desperdiciarla durante minutos. Años después, cuando aprendí que menos del 1% del agua del mundo es potable, me cuestionaba la calidad de la educación que recibí y sus implicaciones en la sostenibilidad de mis propias prácticas. Hoy, tal vez como una forma de reivindicarme con mi propia historia de vida, trato que mis hijos valoren los preciosos recursos naturales que consumen todos los días, pensando no solo en sí mismos, sino en que, como decía Kant, deberíamos actuar de tal manera que si nuestro comportamiento se pudiera generalizar a la humanidad, entonces el mundo sería un lugar mejor. Como decía Gandhi, seamos nosotros mismos el cambio que deseamos ver en el mundo. Hoy tenemos una excelente oportunidad para informarnos, pensar y reflexionar sobre cómo nuestras capacidades de cooperación y manejo del conflicto contribuirán a forjar el futuro que legaremos a las nuevas generaciones, representadas aquí por estudiantes de la Universidad Nacional, del Colegio Humanístico de Heredia y del Colegio Europeo que nos honran con su grata presencia. Gracias, jóvenes, por acompañarnos. A continuación, escucharemos las palabras de la señora rectora adjunta, doña Alejandra Gamboa.
Muy buenos días para todas las personas que nos acompañan en la mesa principal, al doctor Harvey Whitehouse, al colega Diego Conejo, a don Pablo Chaverri y a ustedes, los compañeros estudiantes que hoy están visitando este hermoso auditorio, también a los estudiantes y a la academia presente. Tengan todos y todas muy buenos días. Distinguidas personas para que están acá, es un honor realmente darles una bienvenida a esta conferencia que se ha denominado ¿Qué mundo legaremos a las nuevas generaciones? Conflicto y cooperación en la configuración del futuro de la humanidad. Este es un espacio de reflexión que nos convoca para pensar los desafíos fundamentales que enfrenta la humanidad en el presente siglo. Nuestra evolución biológica y cultural nos ha dotado de disposiciones profundas hacia la pertenencia, la creencia y la cohesión social. Sin embargo, en el contexto actual, estas mismas características se manifiestan en escenarios de creciente polarización, conflictos complejos y significativas tensiones ambientales. También las tenemos en la actualidad referidas al financiamiento de la educación superior que sostiene la universidad pública para el país. La historia también de las civilizaciones humanas, marcada por el desarrollo de tecnologías, de sistemas de organización social y estructuras de poder cada vez más sofisticadas que nos sitúan hoy ante un momento crítico. Ante este panorama, resulta imprescindible preguntarnos, ¿es este el destino inevitable de nuestra evolución o existen alternativas que nos permitan redirigir nuestro futuro? También nos podemos cuestionar cómo podemos transformar nuestras predisposiciones bioculturales en herramientas para la cooperación pacífica, para el desarrollo sostenible. La historia de las civilizaciones humanas ha sido marcada por el desarrollo de tecnologías, por esos sistemas de organización que decía, y nos enfrentamos simultáneamente a avances científicos sin precedentes y a profundas crisis ambientales, a desigualdades estructurales, a conflictos geopolíticos, como mencionaba Pablo, a fragmentaciones sociales que ponen en tensión la sostenibilidad misma de la vida humana y planetaria. Ante este panorama, nos resulta imprescindible preguntarnos si este es verdaderamente el destino inevitable de nuestra evolución o si por el contrario, aún conservamos la capacidad ética, política y cultural de reorientar nuestro futuro común. La respuesta a esta interrogante no depende únicamente del desarrollo tecnológico, sino de nuestra capacidad para transformar las predisposiciones bioculturales que históricamente han favorecido la competencia, el miedo o la exclusión en herramientas orientadas hacia la cooperación, la solidaridad y la construcción de sociedades más justas y sostenibles. La humanidad posee también una extraordinaria capacidad para esto que conocemos como empatía, la colaboración y la creación colectiva de conocimiento. A lo largo de la historia, las grandes transformaciones civilizatorias no han surgido únicamente de la imposición del poder, sino de la posibilidad de construir acuerdos, de reconocer la dignidad humana y de ampliar los horizontes de convivencia entre las diferencias. En este contexto, la educación, la ciencia y la cultura adquieren una relevancia estratégica. Transformar nuestras predisposiciones bioculturales implica reconocer que el futuro no está predeterminado. Significa comprender que la cooperación puede ser tan constitutiva de lo humano como el conflicto, que la sostenibilidad requiere nuevas formas de relación con la naturaleza y con los otros, y que el desarrollo solo tendrá sentido si está orientado a garantizar condiciones de vida digna para todas las personas. Para abordar esta temática, nos honra contar con la presencia del doctor Harvey Whitehouse, profesor de Antropología Social en la Universidad de Oxford. Asimismo, es fundador de un proyecto muy interesante que destaca la iniciativa internacional dedicada al análisis comparativo de la evolución de las sociedades humanas. Creo y sostengo que la presencia del doctor Whitehouse, su trayectoria académica y su más reciente obra, Herencia, los orígenes evolutivos del mundo moderno, van a constituir un aporte significativo para que quienes lo escuchan, tanto en este auditorio como por streaming, podrán comprender la relación entre nuestra herencia evolutiva y los desarrollos contemporáneos. Confiamos en que esta conferencia les contribuya y nos contribuya al fortalecimiento del pensamiento crítico y al enriquecimiento del diálogo académico en torno a un tema de tanta relevancia global. Les agradecemos profundamente desde la Rectoría y la Rectoría Adjunta la presencia del conferencista y de nuestro colega y de toda la iniciativa para que hoy ustedes, estudiantes de los diversos colegios que nos acompañan, puedan tener una visión clara y sobre todo se lleven muchísimas preguntas y también una posibilidad de hacer acciones en el aquí y en el ahora tendientes a un mejor futuro. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, doña Alejandra, por sus palabras y por acompañarnos. A continuación, vamos a tener una pequeña introducción a la investigación en temas de cooperación y conflicto en el contexto costarricense. Para hacer esta importante contextualización, me enorgullece presentar a mi colega y amigo, el doctor Luis Diego Conejo Bolaños, quien es un destacadísimo investigador costarricense, compañero en el INEINA, Instituto de Estudios Interdisciplinarios de Niñez y Adolescencia, que ha venido ya durante muchos años investigando diferentes procesos relacionados con la prosocialidad, con la solidaridad, con el desarrollo moral y con cómo básicamente podemos ser mejores personas. Este, creo yo, es un punto clave e incluso de inflexión en la investigación científica en ciencias sociales que con demasiada frecuencia se basó o se centró a veces de forma casi exclusiva en el comportamiento negativo, olvidando que las personas también tenemos la capacidad de actuar pensando en el bien común, lo cual sigue siendo para muchos un reto desde las perspectivas evolutivas. ¿Por qué preocuparnos por otras personas, incluso sacrificándonos nosotros mismos, si eso podría implicar un desgaste a nivel personal? Pese a eso, todos los días vemos también ejemplos de solidaridad, de amor, de pensar antes en el bien común, que tal vez no son parte de las portadas de las noticias. El doctor Diego Conejo posee una maestría en investigación psicológica por la Universidad de Costa Rica y un doctorado en estudios de la familia y desarrollo humano por la Universidad de Columbia en Missouri, Estados Unidos. Y tiene ya 10 años de trabajar en el Instituto de Estudios Interdisciplinarios de Niñez y Adolescencia, aunque también antes trabajó para UNICEF. Investigó también en el Instituto de Investigaciones Psicológicas y en el Centro de Investigaciones en Neurociencias de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Demos un aplauso de bienvenida al doctor Diego Conejo.
Muy buenos días. Agradezco a las diferentes personas que se pudieron hacer presentes en esta importante actividad, miembros importantes de la comunidad universitaria. Un especial saludo al profesor doctor White, em, perdón, Whitehouse. Y quisiera enmarcar esta breve introducción en la importancia que tiene esta temática para nosotros como sociedad. Se está en una gran discusión de si solamente deberíamos invertir en ciencia y tecnología que nos permita contar con dispositivos para llegar a la luna y para llegar a otras latitudes, pero ¿de qué nos sirve contar con esa tecnología si los conflictos que vamos a tener con nuestro vecino o con una persona en la calle con la cual no nos podemos poner de acuerdo, lo vamos a resolver a punta de balazos? Y yo creo que eso nos tiene que poner a pensar en la importancia de también invertir en las ciencias del desarrollo, en las ciencias humanas, en las ciencias sociales y en la educación. Como sociedad nos necesitamos desde los distintos puntos del conocimiento y creo que esta oportunidad me honra poder referirme a ustedes en esta temática tan importante a propósito de la visita del profesor Whitehouse. Y lo que quiero hacer es una breve contextualización de cómo el trabajo que hemos venido realizando desde el INEINA en los últimos años se vincula con el importante trabajo del profesor Whitehouse. Y quisiera empezar refiriéndome un poco al INEINA, el cual fue fundado en 1988 y tiene una serie de áreas de trabajo que tienen que ver con la calidad de la educación y su impacto en el desarrollo humano integral, investigaciones con respecto a la familia, a los derechos y políticas públicas y la desigualdad social y su impacto en el desarrollo humano y educativo de las personas menores de edad. Un poco también para que pongamos más rostros a estas personas. Ahí presento la foto del último paseo que hicimos en Navidad del equipo del INEINA. Faltan algunas personas, pero hay importantes representaciones ahí. Ok. Lo primero que nosotros tenemos que tomar en cuenta es que somos seres biopsicosociales. Eso quiere decir que desde el momento de la concepción, inclusive cuando estamos en el vientre materno, lo que está sucediendo nos está afectando. Y en este estudio que realizamos con colegas del Instituto Regional de Estudios en Sustancias Tóxicas, el IRED, también acá en la Universidad Nacional, en una corte de nacimiento, pudimos determinar que la exposición durante el embarazo a diferentes sustancias químicas, por ejemplo, el plaguicida 2,4-D o los clorpirifos que se usan como venenos para controlar plagas. Esa exposición, mayores medidas a esas sustancias estuvieron vinculadas con menor rendimiento en neurodesarrollo al año de vida, en lenguaje, en desarrollo cognitivo y en desarrollo motor. Y ahí tenemos un primer elemento. La desigualdad y la inequidad inicia inclusive desde que estamos en el vientre materno. Y las injusticias ambientales, en este caso la exposición a plaguicidas, empiezan a tener sus efectos de deterioro en la salud. También hemos investigado cómo el autocontrol no es solamente una función cognitiva que está dentro de la mente de las personas, sino que niños y niñas que tienen una relación de confianza o de desconfianza con quien les está evaluando, presentan un comportamiento diferencial en esta capacidad de autocontrol. Además, en este estudio pudimos también determinar cómo el estatus socioeconómico tiene un papel importante en esta capacidad de autocontrol, dado que a mayores bienes y servicios que contaban con estas personas en su hogar, mayores capacidades de autocontrol mostraban en la tarea experimental. Por otro lado, también hemos investigado cómo se vinculan algunas funciones sociocognitivas importantes, como por ejemplo la teoría de la mente, que es mi capacidad de pensar en los estados mentales de otras personas y saber que son diferentes a los míos. Esa importante función se vincula también con el control inhibitorio, es decir, con mi capacidad de tener una respuesta que es preponderante para poder ofrecer una alternativa que es más adaptativa en ese contexto. Esas funciones se vinculan, se integran y hacen que las personas puedan cooperar y realizar tareas de resolución de problemas de una manera más efectiva. Por otro lado, también hemos investigado el tema de la socialización de la prosocialidad, es decir, cuáles son las estrategias que padres, madres y personas encargadas de niños y niñas utilizan para ayudar a niños y niñas a que interioricen una serie de valores que tienen que ver con el respeto, que tienen que ver con las relaciones interpersonales y que tienen que ver con la colaboración, con ser prosociales. Inclusive cuando ese ser prosocial significa un costo para el sí mismo, un costo de sacrificio de sus recursos en pro de otra persona que no necesariamente forma parte de su familia. Hemos también investigado algunos conceptos más amplios que tienen que ver con el andamiaje afectivo que se lleva a cabo en el hogar por medio de tareas de lectura compartida y cómo esos espacios que las familias pueden aprovechar para intimar con sus niños y niñas son ideales para la transmisión de valores, para la regulación emocional y para tener discusiones importantísimas que tienen que ver con la evolución de los valores, la interiorización de las normas. Asimismo, hemos también recientemente publicado un estudio que indagaba los efectos negativos del ciberacoso en las personas adolescentes con una muestra representativa en Costa Rica gracias al estudio de Kids Online y determinamos cómo hay una serie de variables que aumentan el riesgo de que las personas sufran este acoso cibernético y esto también deteriora, por supuesto, la salud mental de las personas. Y el trabajo también en esta línea de nuestro colega Pablo es muy importante para entender cómo se están determinando estas tensiones culturales, cómo la cooperación choca con algunos dilemas estructurales y qué tiene que ver el individualismo y el colectivismo y estas orientaciones culturales en este entramado. Es importante también dejar claro que desde el INE y INA, nosotros no solamente estamos preocupados por la creación de conocimiento científico, sino que también, y creo que más importante, es cómo llevamos este conocimiento a las realidades comunitarias, a las realidades educativas y a las realidades familiares. Y en ese sentido, me alegra señalar que hemos realizado una serie de actividades que tienen que ver con talleres de crianza, con espacios en las escuelas para que los chicos y chicas puedan hablar sobre lo que les preocupa en términos de su seguridad, en términos de las amenazas que perciben en la comunidad. Hemos también participado fortaleciendo capacidades en instituciones públicas y especialmente el trabajo de Pablo que se ha dedicado a incidir en políticas públicas que cada vez más se basen en evidencia y se basen en los estudios con los cuales contamos para que las decisiones que se toman puedan ser constantemente revisadas, puedan ser constantemente mejoradas y entonces los resultados que le llegan a chicos y chicas y familias en nuestro país sean de mejor calidad. Y bueno, ya para terminar, entonces, todos estos elementos que venía conversando son una serie de mecanismos próximos que tienen que ver con la cooperación y el conflicto. Pero, por supuesto que existen otros elementos, mecanismos más distales, que es el trabajo que precisamente el doctor Whitehouse ha venido investigando y creo que va a ser muy enriquecedor para nosotros tener la oportunidad de primera mano escuchar estas investigaciones para poder darle mayor amplitud y mayor vínculo a los estudios que nosotros hemos realizado con los orígenes de las capacidades humanas que tienen que ver con la cooperación y con cómo resolvemos los conflictos de una manera tal que los bienes materiales, que el daño a algún objeto no se interponga en nuestra capacidad de apreciar una vida humana y de podernos respetar como personas más allá de quiénes somos o de cuánto poseemos. Les agradezco su atención. Ahí están las referencias de los estudios y ahora seguimos con la conferencia principal. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Diego, por esa importantísima introducción y contextualización. Muy bien, ahora vamos a entrar ya a nuestra conferencia principal del día de hoy, titulada ¿Qué futuro legaremos a las nuevas generaciones? Conflicto y cooperación en la configuración del futuro. Antes de dar la palabra al distinguido expositor de hoy, quisiera hacer una brevísima introducción a quién es el doctor Harvey Whitehouse, la cual, por supuesto, no hace justicia a su enorme currículum, por lo cual pido disculpas. El doctor Harvey Whitehouse es profesor de antropología social de la Universidad de Oxford y miembro del Magdalen College. Es director del Centro para el Estudio de la Cohesión Social y director fundador de CESHAT, una vasta base de datos sobre la historia humana que permite a académicos y científicos poner a prueba hipótesis sobre el auge y la caída de las civilizaciones humanas. Su último libro, Inheritance: The Evolutionary Origins of the Modern World, publicado en 2024 por Penguin, está ahora publicado en español bajo el título Herencia: Los orígenes evolutivos del mundo moderno. El profesor Whitehouse nos plantea que nuestra psicología evolucionada nos predispone a tres cosas: conformarnos, creer y pertenecer. A lo largo de miles de años de evolución cultural, estas predisposiciones se han moldeado y extendido a través del auge de tecnologías más sofisticadas, religiones más organizadas, imperios más expansivos. Pero ahora, por primera vez, la naturaleza humana nos está llevando hacia el futuro, hacia un futuro de polarización política sin precedentes, guerras más mortíferas y destrucción ambiental, llevándonos hasta tribus de Nueva Guinea, milicias libias, antiguos yacimientos de arqueología y también laboratorios de psicología infantil. Harvey Whitehouse disertará sobre cómo podemos crear las condiciones para gestionar conflictos y fomentar formas pacíficas y sostenibles de cooperación en el futuro. Luego de su exposición, abriremos el espacio para que quienes así lo deseen puedan compartir sus ideas y preguntas con el profesor Whitehouse, para quien pido un aplauso.
Well, hang on, let me just move this. Okay, well, first of all, my warmest thanks to the hosts of this event at UNA for their very generous introductory words, and thanks to all of you for coming along this morning. So let's start with the bad news. The world that we are bequeathing to the next generation is in bad shape. The problems, of course, are familiar to all of us. We've heard about some of them already this morning. So it's not exactly news. These problems include, of course, climate change and biodiversity loss, polarization, authoritarianism, mass violence, a global spiraling incarceration crisis, and global disorder. Now, in some of these cases, we actually know exactly what the problems are, and we know how to fix them. Take climate change, for example. Scientists agree that global heating is caused by human activities. We know what actions are needed to reduce CO2 emissions, And we know that if we don't, the consequences are very dire. And yet, at a global level, our collective efforts to address the problem are gravely inadequate. Why? Why do humans so often discount the future, apparently sleepwalking into avoidable disasters? Why do we fail to cooperate globally when we know we would all be far better off if we could all pull together? Why are so many people persuaded by leaders who dismiss the scientific evidence on climate change and drive through policies that benefit their commercial interests and their political interests at the expense of the rest of us? I often meet with people who think that they can answer these questions quite easily. For example, they might point to things like greed or poor leadership or structural problems in society or in our economic systems. But they rarely have a good explanation as to why those defects are present in the first place. And they can't really tell us how we can help the next generation do any better than we have done. I've spent my career searching for answers to these problems based on scientific research methods. And the aim of this talk is really to summarize what I've learned. My search for answers to these questions began here in the rainforests of Papua New Guinea, where I went to live for 2 years as part of my doctoral research. In those days, I was at the University of Cambridge. The group I lived with took me in as a member of their community. They helped me to learn their unwritten language and the intricacies of their ancient rituals and beliefs. They had no running water, they had no electricity, and they had very little money because they mostly lived off the food that they grew in their gardens and the animals that they hunted in the forest. But they had a very rich culture. The tribes of this region spoke different languages and dialects, each of them following their own distinctive ceremonies and religious beliefs and styles of music and dance. Until quite recently, these tribes had been at war with each other. But by the time I went to live with them, they'd established a popular movement uniting all the different cultural groups of the region. It was known as a kivung, which means a meeting or to meet. Not only did the movement establish peace among warring tribes, it also virtually eliminated crime, a feat that's all the more extraordinary when you consider that Papua New Guinea has long suffered from some of the highest rates of violent crime of any country anywhere in the world. And on top of that, for many decades, the kivung has successfully protected a huge portion of the rainforest from destruction by logging companies and mining operations and other commercial interests. The success of this movement can be attributed to several distinctive features. First, the kivung created a set of agreed upon laws, and it organized frequent community meetings to discuss how effectively the laws were being followed across the diverse ethnic groups that signed up to the movement. The leaders used these meetings to impose fines on anyone who broke the kivung laws, after which they carried out particular rituals of forgiveness and reconciliation. One distinctive feature of this was deep reverence for the ancestors who were seen as the originators of the laws. And food offerings to the ancestors were laid out every day in special temples involving elaborate rituals. Second, the kivung created extremely strong feelings of kinship among members of the tribe, partly through powerful rituals, but also by emphasizing our connections to the ancestors. And as you can see, I went through some of these rituals myself. The kivung effectively bonded people to the group and to its laws. It sounds very simple, but actually the psychology and history on which the kivung was constructed was really very complex. And I've spent my entire career trying to understand how these astonishing feats of cooperation were accomplished. And much of my work has been carried out in collaboration with some of the world's most brilliant psychologists, archaeologists, and evolutionary scientists. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on 4 features of our evolved psychology. supernatural agent constructs, moral reasoning, ritual, and tribalism. All four of these elements have played a central role in the rise of ever larger and more complex civilizations over the course of world history. And understanding how is vital to our future as a species, and I'll argue for the future of our planet. So let's start with supernatural agent constructs. Some people would argue that believing in gods and other supernatural agents is a bad thing, and we should try to eliminate those kinds of beliefs. Indeed, some of the world's most famous atheists fall into this category. But there are also many atheists like me who believe that supernatural beliefs cannot be eliminated, and we should therefore try to maximize their positive effects in the world and minimize harmful ones. Those who study religion scientifically often fall into this second category. I'm going to talk you through some of the evidence that supernatural beliefs are rooted in our evolved psychology, and for that reason, they just will not go away. And I'm going to give you some examples of how the same features of religion that can be used to produce destructive outcomes, like intergroup violence, for example, could also be harnessed to produce more peaceful, more compassionate, and more sustainable societies. And this is really the best future for religion that I think humanity can realistically hope for. Some of our most widespread ideas about the supernatural are rooted in our intuitions about the behavior of physical objects. Long before we've had a chance to observe very much about the physics of the world around us, we already expect unsupported objects to fall earthwards. If you think of a ball, for example, if you let go of it, you would intuitively expect it to fall towards the ground rather than to float off up into the air. When it reaches the ground, you would intuitively expect it to bounce or break, or maybe even crack the surface of the object it lands on. You wouldn't expect it to pass through the solid ground at your feet. In order to reach the ground, you would also expect the ball to pass through space in a continuous trajectory and not just simply to disappear at one point and reappear at some other point. These principles of intuitive physics have become known as intuitive gravity, object solidity, and object coherence. And they're principles that emerge naturally in development all around the world as young children mature. They form part, basically, of our evolved psychological toolkit for navigating the physical world around us. When objects don't behave in accordance with our intuitive physics, we find this very alluring and attention-grabbing. And what's more, our research has shown that even before we can speak, we expect agents who demonstrate the ability to break the laws of intuitive physics to assert dominance over ordinary mortals who lack those special powers. In this particular study, we showed babies a video in which two cartoon-like agents competed for a reward. Both characters advanced across a steep valley in pursuit of the reward, but whereas the natural agents had to obey the constraints of intuitive gravity by actually walking down one side of the valley and across the valley floor and up the other side, the supernatural agent was able to fly across the valley from one side to the other, thereby exhibiting the power to defy gravity. As the two agents then approached the reward, they found themselves in a standoff. Each was hoping to edge forward and grab the desired resource. And the key question was, would our babies in the sample expect the magical agent to win or the natural agent? And the results of this experiment were really striking. Pre-verbal infants showed clear evidence of surprise when the natural agent won in this contest, suggesting that they expected the agent capable of defying gravity to exercise social dominance. How do we know this? Well, obviously we couldn't ask the infants because they were too young to speak. But in studies like this, we can infer how surprised babies are by measuring how long they stare at the screen when the video ends, rather than just looking away. And in this case, we found that the infants stared longer at the screen when the natural agent won the contest, suggesting this is not what they were expecting to happen. This was one of the first studies to show that long before we can even speak or understand the culture of the communities we're born into, we already expect agents with supernatural powers to exert social dominance over others. This may also help to explain why religious figures of all kinds, from shamans and soothsayers to priests and prophets and messiahs and divine kings, all of these kinds of figures are accorded higher status in human societies than those who lack any special supernatural qualities or powers. Now, babies know a lot of things intuitively, but one thing they're not very good at figuring out is what other people are thinking. However, by around 3 or 4 years of age, children have developed various capacities for making sense of other people's mental states. For example, by around this age, we can appreciate that other people have beliefs and desires, that they can hold both true and false representations of the world around us, and that they can be deceived. And that means, of course, they in turn can also tell us lies. All of this may sound rather abstract, but it has very concrete effects on how the way ideas about supernatural beings arise and spread in human societies. Consider, for example, the idea of a ghost or a spirit, that part of the person that's imagined to live on after we die. Such an idea is found in every society so far documented by anthropologists, and there's abundant evidence also of such ideas throughout world history and deep into the myths of prehistory as well. Why? The answer lies, at least partly, I think, in the way that ghost constructs build on our intuitive beliefs. To create a very simple ghost concept, all you have to do is to imagine a perfectly normal physical agent, but then ascribe to it some counterintuitive properties, like the ability to defy gravity by floating upwards or being able to pass through solid walls. In seances, ghosts are often also portrayed as telepathically knowing what we're thinking. Or in divinations, they might be able to tell us about other people's dirty secrets or evil intentions. Such constructs are described as minimally counterintuitive, or MCI for short. They're minimally counterintuitive in the sense that they typically involve just 1 or 2 small violations of our innate intuitions, just enough to be attention-grabbing and memorable and catchy, but not so counterintuitive as to leave us confused. And so as a result, simple ghost concepts have been documented all around the world, but not beliefs in beings that only exist on Wednesdays or that can only communicate through calculus. Ghosts feature in many of the world religions, particularly in the form of ancestor veneration. For example, in many regions of Asia, Africa, Oceania, indigenous American groups, and so on, you find these kinds of constructs. In many organized religions, the ghost concept has been entangled in various ways with ideas about the fate of the soul after death. And of course, in the case of Christianity, with rather abstract ideas about the Holy Ghost. What happens in organized religions is that they take certain universally recognized ideas, MCI constructs like the idea of a ghost, for example, and they turn them into something much more sophisticated as part of an elaborate ideology or theology. Typically, they treat certain versions of these ideas as authorized and theologically correct, if you like, while more popular variants get dismissed as mere superstition or even heresy. So, for example, a particular Christian tradition might endorse the Holy Ghost concept, but reject the idea of poltergeist or haunted houses. Typically, the rejected ideas are also the catchier ones. My colleagues and I refer to these catchy variants as wild religion. If organized religions were a bit like the well-cultivated gardens of a monastery, wild religions are kind of like the weeds that keep blowing in on the wind, and that the monks and the nuns have to keep rooting up in order to keep the garden looking neat and tidy. But even if organized religions try to keep wild variants in check, in the world of commercial enterprise, wild religion is really big business. Take Santa, for example. He's presented to us as a human-like agent in all respects, except that he can magically pass through narrow passages like chimneys. So he violates our intuitive expectations about object solidity. Santa and his reindeer also, of course, have the magical power of flight, so he violates our principle of intuitive gravity as well. Santa also violates our theory of mind expectations by magically knowing whether we've been naughty or nice. Presumably, he does this by monitoring the thoughts and behaviors of all children all around the world at the same time. And that socially very salient MCI feature of Santa Claus may be one of the clinchers that helps to explain not only why children are enchanted by this idea, but why adults buy into it at Christmas. And we do buy into it in a big way. Santa is a huge money spinner, with worldwide expenditure on Christmas exceeding $1 trillion by some estimates. That's more than the GDP of most countries. But it's not just Santa whose marketability depends on the appeal of MCIs. We also have to consider the value of Halloween, with its flying witches and its counterintuitive zombies. Each year, Halloween merchandise is worth around $10 billion in America alone. Then there's also Chinese New Year with its fire-breathing dragons and evil spirits. That's worth around $150 billion per annum. And of course, there are countless other festivals involving MCIs all around the world. Now, towards the end of this talk, I'm going to argue that there are much better ways of harnessing our natural tendency to catch these wild MCI kinds of concepts. But first, let's work through some of the other features of our evolved psychology that I mentioned earlier. The second feature on my list was moral reasoning. Now, until quite recently, it seemed reasonable to argue that different cultural groups endorse radically different moral principles, and that your intuitions about what's right and wrong, basically, are determined by the culture, including the religion, that you just happen to have been brought up in. However, my colleague in Oxford, Oliver Scott Curry, noticed that 7 cooperative principles found across the natural world are also found across many aspects of human moral reasoning. These 7 principles are as follows: be loyal to your group, help your family, return favors, be brave, defer to superiors, divide resources fairly, and respect other people's property. My colleagues and I set out to test the hypothesis that all 7 of these forms of cooperation will be judged morally good in all human societies everywhere. To test our hypothesis, we undertook a huge survey of the writings of anthropologists pertaining to moral values in a sample of 60 societies selected to represent the diversity of all surviving human cultures worldwide, covering all major ethnographic regions. We analyzed thousands of paragraphs of text describing moral judgments, and we found that in 99.9% of all examples, the 7 rules that I just listed were judged morally good rather than bad or neutral. This was pretty spectacular support for our hypothesis, and it suggests that there is indeed a universal moral compass which guides the thinking of human beings everywhere, regardless of cultural differences. Now, many people think that religion plays a vitally important role in bolstering commitment to moral norms. These are the results of a Pew survey in which people around the world were asked whether you needed to believe in God in order to be moral. As you can see, in much of the world, the majority of people think that the answer to that question is yes. However, what most people don't realize is that the connection between moral concerns and supernatural agents only came about with the rise of the first really large-scale societies. In most small-scale indigenous religions, anthropologists have found that people generally imagine spirits and ancestors and gods to be pretty unconcerned about whether people behave morally to one another in general. Supernatural beings are typically beings that demand respect and obedience and are thought to punish those who offend them, but they mostly don't care very much how we behave towards one another. The first truly moralizing gods first appeared with the rise of empires, mostly but not exclusively in the first millennium BCE. This was a period in world history that's sometimes described as an axial age. It's a period in which more ethical philosophies and religious systems emerged and spread. I'm the co-founder of a large database known as SEISHAT, Global History Data Bank. And our analyses of the data in SEISHAT have shown that moralizing religions became established when societies became too large and internally diverse to sustain cooperation based simply on shared culture, shared ethnicity. As growing empires conquered and absorbed more and more different groups, all of them speaking different languages and following different customs, they increasingly needed a common identity and a set of shared norms in order to cooperate. And this was provided by the first moralizing religions, which of course included Hinduism, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Later, with the emergence of religions like Christianity and Islam, some of these moralizing ideas became sacred values, capable of motivating holy wars. These moralizing religions all emphasize the idea that good deeds will be rewarded and wickedness punished. In the contemporary world, this idea also has a commercial application. And one great example of this, believe it or not, is what we call the news. Like MCIs in advertising, moralizing in the news is really big business. Just like organized religions, companies manipulate our moral intuitions to influence behavior, but they do it indirectly, particularly through the medium of news feeds. When news providers sell us stories about the moral transgressions of others, whether it's the grisly details of violent crimes or the horrors of warfare or the scandalous behavior of the rich and powerful, they're also selling us advertising. This, of course, increases the impression that our societies are increasingly unsafe and unjust, and that our leaders and our institutions are not to be trusted. Now, while things may indeed be getting worse in all of those ways, the danger is that negative impressions become excessively emphasized, and bad news stories undermining cohesion and cooperation become the main fodder, the stuff that we read day to day, day after day in the news. To put it crudely, the past few thousand years have been defined by a process in which our religious and moral intuitions were brought together in a way that enabled us to cooperate on ever larger scales. But now things are moving in the opposite direction, insofar as our religious and moral intuitions are being corralled by commercial interests in ways that have divisive effects. Populists and conspiracy theorists and disruptors of various kinds can easily take advantage of this. Okay, the next item on my list, if you remember, was ritual. All human societies worldwide and throughout the known past have performed rituals. In fact, my last book, the one before Inheritance, was devoted to that topic. Rituals are universal because of a strange quirk in our evolved behavioral repertoire that psychologists refer to as over-imitation. Psychologists have known for a long time that if you show children an unnecessarily complicated way of retrieving an object from a box, they'll copy not only the causally necessary behavior, but they'll also copy the pointless actions. In fact, even if you tell them to look out for silly elements, that don't really help to get the object out of the box, they still copy them. It's as if they can't really help themselves. This is what psychologists mean by this term over-imitation. In a series of experiments, my colleagues and I have shown that children over-imitate more faithfully and they innovate less when the behavior they've observed has no possible instrumental value. This effect increases if we think that the behavior being observed is something that everyone in the group is doing. And children copy even more fastidiously if they're worried about being left out of the group. In other words, we copy arbitrary conventions in order to affiliate with others and to establish a secure position for ourselves within the group. Now, this natural human tendency to imitate conventional behaviors, particularly when we're anxious to blend in, has played an enormous role in past civilizations as well. For most of human prehistory, the cultural traditions associated with different human groups were based on forms of ritualistic copying that were locally distinctive. People copied the conventions and the norms that happened to have become established in their own particular communities, but these communities were typically small. In many cases, they were limited to the people you just happened to know personally. For larger societies to emerge, there needed to be some method of establishing a common set of customs and practices. Now, a major breakthrough in this regard was the discovery of routinized ritual, the habit of carrying out conventional behaviors on a day-to-day basis, many of them in the form of collective rituals. Routinizing collective rituals has two very powerful effects. Firstly, it makes deviations from the standard script easy to detect. And that means that when people step out of line, they can be sanctioned. Secondly, when rituals become habitual, this makes us less reflective and more willing to accept whatever the group's leaders tell us. Both of these factors take conformism to a new level. The power of routinization is that it allows you to establish shared norms and conventions at scale and to do so very efficiently. Some of the earliest evidence for increasingly routinized rituals comes from Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia in what's now modern Turkey. This is one of the first regions on Earth where farming emerged and spread. At Çatalhöyük, people were beginning to plant crops like wheat and barley, and they were beginning to domesticate animals, first of all, sheep and goat, and then eventually cattle. I went to stay at this site many years running in order to work with the director of excavations, Ian Hodder from Stanford University. Hodder and I came to the conclusion that over the nearly 2,000 years of settlement at Çatalhöyük, the ritual life was changing. In particular, rituals associated with domestic spaces and farming practices were becoming more frequent, and the more ancient sporadic rituals associated with hunting and feasting were dying out. And as rituals became more frequent, many features of the cultural system became more standardized. For example, stamp seals and pottery designs started to look more similar, and they spread to larger and larger groups. As a result, the first really large-scale cultural traditions were starting to emerge. And together with my collaborators, we found evidence for similar patterns across scores of other archaeological sites spanning this transition with the rise and spread of farming. The power of routinization is that it allows you to spread a shared set of identity markers to a really large population and to do it very quickly. All you need is a handful of proselytizing leaders who are willing to travel from one settlement to the next, spreading the same ideas and behaviors, and soon you can create a vast tradition encompassing hundreds of communities. And you can stabilize and maintain that tradition over time by repeating the beliefs and practices very frequently, just as all the world religions do, of course, in their churches and synagogues and mosques and temples. That helps to explain how routinized religions contributed to the spread of larger and larger societies. But what's happening now? Well, in some ways, the world religions have continued to practice these methods of routinization. They continue to maintain their orthodoxies using these age-old methods of getting people to sing from the same hymn sheet, if you like, both literally and metaphorically. However, they've also brought about some pretty seismic changes in the role of over-imitation in our societies in recent years. Firstly, we've seen, of course, the rise of some very powerful secular forms of government that have harnessed routinized rituals as a way of maintaining their orthodoxies, for example, in the former Soviet Union and China. Secondly, we've witnessed the rise of new methods of spreading beliefs and practices with very high fidelity. Most importantly, of course, the invention of the internet, which allows ideas to spread intact to millions of people at the stroke of a button. Thirdly, a new form of routinized ideology has emerged and spread in the form of free market capitalism. However, routinized rituals are also now declining in many countries. In the UK, for example, we're less likely to engage in highly structured domestic rituals like family meal times compared with previous generations. Our ideas about formal education are increasingly focused on instrumental outcomes like exam results and league tables. Our workplaces are likewise organized around audit culture and ideas about maximizing efficiency. Working hours are becoming more flexible and less synchronized, and factory production lines are becoming automated. At the same time, as more old-fashioned forms of cohesion have gone into decline, new varieties of conformism have become established in their place. Advertising is now increasingly shaped by algorithms that track what kinds of content we like to view on the internet, and accordingly it directs us to more and more of it. In effect, our consumption of products and ideas is being herded in ways that suit commercial interests, rather than the interests of society as a whole. For example, advertisers have discovered that many people will buy clothing that displays a prestigious label, not because they think it'll necessarily be warmer or more comfortable or even better quality, but because the label tells you something about the wearer's social identity and their status. Advertisers have also begun to realize that they've come to realize that which social cues are most effective at tapping into which sets of motivations when it comes to over-imitation. Okay, let's now turn to the very last feature on my list, which is all about tribalism. Nation states and world religions commonly function as tribes. That is, they create cohesion and they inspire a loyal commitment to their symbols and to their beliefs and to their practices as well on the part of followers. To understand how this works, we need to understand the basics of how group identities are formed and how they motivate tribalistic behaviors. Research in social identity theory has shown that we all have basically two kinds of identities. On the one hand, we all have a personal self, qualities that make us unique as individual persons. But on the other hand, we also have membership of other groups. Sometimes we wear many hats as members of many different kinds of groups. For most people, most of the time, their personal and their group identities are experienced as quite distinct and separate. So if you make people's group identities salient, their personal identities become less accessible. And partly for this reason, psychologists often describe group identification as depersonalizing. It's a bit like your group identity can eclipse and obscure your sense of self. But there's also another very powerful form of group alignment known as identity fusion, in which your personal identity and your group identity effectively become fused together. If you're fused with a group, your personal and group identities are activated together. So when your personal self is made salient, your group identity is made salient at the same time. And this fosters a kind of enhanced sense of inner strength, even a sense of invulnerability. And it works the other way around as well. If you make the group salient to a fused individual, this taps directly into their sense of personal agency. People who are highly fused with a group say they'll do almost anything to protect their fellow group members, risking or even laying down their lives if necessary to save them. Now, people become fused to a group in two main ways. One is to undergo an experience that becomes a core feature of who you are, like a painful or a frightening ritual or other kinds of experience. When experiences like these become not only part of your personal identity, but are felt to be group defining as well, your personal and group identities effectively become fused together. Another way of becoming fused with a group is to believe that you're made of the same physical substance as other group members. For example, people in the same family typically think they share the same blood or the same facial characteristics or other physical traits. Even though different cultures have different ways of conceptualizing shared biology within families, the underlying psychology is always fundamentally the same. For example, people always assume that these shared physical traits, whatever they may be, are passed down from parents to offspring. Often this notion of shared biology is scaled up so that members of the same tribe believe that they're descended from the same common ancestors, or they might think of their territory as a shared motherland. In large studies of twins, we've shown that both of these elements contribute to feelings of fusion among siblings. For example, we found that identical twins are more fused than fraternal twins based on feeling more similar biologically. But independently of those effects, twins who think that they've been profoundly shaped by the same life experiences become fused in that way as well. To measure levels of fusion, we typically show people a series of pictures. Each picture contains a small circle, that's you, and a big circle, that's your group. And they're shown as intersecting in varying degrees. At one end of the spectrum, the two circles are completely separate, but at the other end, the little circle, remember that's you, is shown to be completely contained within the larger circle, which is your group. And people are asked to say which of these representations of their relationship to the group best captures how they feel about the group. And those who choose the one in which the small circle is completely encompassed by the larger circle representing the group are said to be fused. Now, fusion is an extremely powerful form of group bonding. If you're fused with your group and it comes under attack, you'll do whatever it takes to protect that group, even if it involves acts of self-sacrifice. We've shown in studies with a wide range of groups, from hardline Islamists to passionate football fans, that fusion plays a crucial role in willingness to defend the group, even at very grave personal cost. A good example of this is the work we did in 2011 during the Arab Spring, when one of my collaborators, Brian McQuinn, who's pictured here, managed to get into Libya in the midst of the revolution, thanks to his UN contacts. And he in turn helped me get into the country to set up a survey with insurgent groups. This place that we're standing in here is what was formerly, it's in Misrata in Libya, and was previously a busy marketplace. And it was used by Gaddafi's forces quite ineffectually, as you can see in this photograph, to hide their tanks from NATO airstrikes. Our survey was run with 179 members of various revolutionary battalions. We found that all armed insurgents were highly fused with their families and highly fused with their fellow combatants or revolutionaries. But there was a twist. Half our sample were frontline fighters, and half of our sample provided logistical support to the frontline fighters by driving ambulances and fixing vehicles and that kind of thing. And so we asked participants in our survey a forced choice question. We said that you're fused with multiple groups, with your families, with fellow revolutionaries, etc. But if you had to choose which group mattered to you most, which would it be? And what we found was that if you were a frontline fighter, you were far more likely to choose your friends in your battalion, even over your own family. This was a really striking finding because it meant that your fellow fighters were more like family to you than your actual family. With providers of logistical support, that wasn't typically the case. In other words, those who suffered more shared dysphoria and horror on the front line of the battle were more highly fused with one another. Now, identity fusion evolved in small groups, binding together people in face-to-face communities in which basically people knew everyone else personally. So how do we get from that kind of small-scale bonding to much larger-scale phenomena like nationalism or strong commitment to transnational religions or really big ethnic identities? In my book, I traced the processes by which military cohesion was scaled up over the millennia, culminating in the emergence of religions capable of fusing us not only to extended groups, but also to the core doctrines that define those groups. These doctrines eventually became sacred values, ideas basically worth dying for. And forms of colonial imperialism emerged in which it became a kind of moral obligation to wage holy wars to bring humanity under the umbrella of a single divinely sanctioned belief system, or to kill the heathens and heretics who refused. All this, of course, has relevance to understanding contemporary violence in the world as well, whether we're talking about revolutionary insurgents or soldiers in conventional armies, or indeed suicide bombers. For example, building on these findings, I teamed up with Julia Ebner, who's an expert on extreme groups and had actually been studying them undercover. Together, Julia and I came up with a plan to try to identify would-be terrorists before it's too late. One of the biggest problems facing the intelligence community is how to spot the terrorists among a vastly larger population of ideological extremists, basically people who espouse unpleasant views, but who are unlikely ever to carry out acts of violence themselves. So Julia and I set out to develop a set of methods for analyzing statistically the writings of political activists to spot the telltale psychological traits that we predicted would lead to acts of violent extremism. This deadly cocktail that we were looking for consisted of 4 key ingredients: fusion with the in-group, a strong belief that the in-group is under threat, demonization of the enemy, and the willingness to use violence if necessary. The aim of our analysis was to pick out language used by political activists as telltale indicators of the presence of this deadly cocktail of ingredients. What we found was that the killers in our sample were far more likely to exhibit all 4 of these deadly cocktail features than those who were non-violent, even if they subscribed to pretty nasty and extremist ideologies. This supports the view that ideological extremism alone is not the driver of violence. The roots of that lie in a combination of factors, basically what we call this deadly cocktail. This award-winning research is now helping the intelligence community and also internet platforms to spot would-be terrorists through their communications. And now Julia and I are applying the same approach to the speeches of authoritarian leaders around the world in order to predict better which of these leaders will be next to unleash mass violence against their perceived enemies. We're currently in the process of building the world's largest database of authoritarian leaders at my college in Oxford. Our central hypothesis is that fanatical leaders, those who unleash mass violence against civilian populations, are motivated by the same deadly cocktail of psychological ingredients as our samples of violent extremists. We can test this hypothesis by analyzing the language of authoritarian leaders for telltale signs of this deadly cocktail, just as we did for political activists in our efforts to pick out would-be terrorists. Okay, I've spent a lot of time summarizing research aimed at understanding the psychology and history that explains our most destructive patterns of behavior, things like overconsumption, violence, globalization, and oppression. The big question then is, can we use that knowledge to develop solutions? I believe we can. For example, as we come to understand the role of tribalism in driving conflicts, it's becoming increasingly clear that the same sources of cohesion could, at least in theory, be leveraged to create a more peaceful and sustainable world. The urgent need to reduce carbon emissions to avoid the most catastrophic effects of global heating is rightly based on arguments from science. However, scientific arguments are not necessarily the most potent ways of motivating action. Evidence for this comes from an experiment I ran with behavioral economist Lucas Reinhardt with the help of Vanuatu's Minister for Climate Change, Ralph Regenvanu, pictured here. In this study, I wrote a series of speeches for the minister to deliver on camera. Each of those speeches had an identical beginning and ending, urging people to act on the climate crisis. But the middle part focused on different arguments for taking action. The first speech emphasized the standard arguments from science, but all the others appealed to the features of our evolved psychology that I've been talking about today. One focused on our universal moral concerns. Another focused on the shared experiences pathway to fusion. And the last one focused on our shared ancestry, the idea that we're all one family. Lucas and I played the videos of these speeches to large samples of people in the UK, the US, and South Africa. And what we found was that the last speech, the one that was emphasizing that we are all one family, had the strongest effect on fusion with humanity. We also found that the fusion-oriented speeches made people feel less hopeless about global warming than the scientific arguments. Crucially, we found that fusion with humanity increased willingness to donate to a climate charity, suggesting that these themes in the speech could actually impact people's behavior and not just their feelings and their attitudes. The obvious conclusion, of course, is that we shouldn't just rely on the arguments of science to address the climate crisis. We need to broaden our approach both to leadership and to the creation of powerful narratives. And one of the things, of course, that organized religion is extremely good at is spinning powerful narratives. All the moralizing religions around the world provide scriptural support for stewardship of the planet. Roughly 7 billion people, that's the vast majority of human beings alive in the world today, align with some religious organization or another. And religious organizations have a huge impact on people's diets and lifestyles. And yet efforts to persuade people to act on the climate crisis fall almost entirely to secular forms of authority, to political leaders, to legislative bodies, to scientists and economists. There's clearly a huge untapped potential here to engage more fully with people's religious beliefs as well. For example, Sikhs around the world celebrated the 550th anniversary of the birth of their founder by attempting to plant 1 million trees around the world. Imagine if all the major rituals of all the world religions contributed in similar ways to tackle climate change. Rituals, of course, also produce cohesion that we can tap into. For example, last year we ran a survey in Rome with a large sample of mourners attending the funeral of Pope Francis. As they queued all night in St. Peter's Square, their shared grief fused them together. We know this because we measured their levels of fusion with each other, as well as their fusion with various other groups. We also measured how concerned they were about climate issues, how much they worried in general about the environment, and we even asked them about their political orientations. Then we offered all the participants in our survey 10 euros and said they could keep the money or they could donate it, or some of it, to a climate charity, namely Guardians of the Earth. Some people donated money and some people didn't. But here's the really interesting part. What determined how much money people gave to this charity was not how concerned they were about climate change. By far the strongest predictor to giving to the climate charity was how fused they'd become with other people queuing up with them who shared their grief during this funeral. We could also harness our natural religiosity to prevent and resolve violent conflicts around the world. Even if they don't always live up to their core values, all the world religions preach values of tolerance and compassion and forgiveness and reconciliation. A key question is how to tap into those features of religion more effectively. And here's just one example. Shortly after the Hamas attacks in October 2023, the Irish politician John Alderdice gave an impassioned speech in the House of Lords in London, arguing that yet more violence in Gaza was not the solution. After reading the speech, it struck me that it might be even more effective still if it emphasized shared sufferings on both sides of the conflict. So what we did was, first of all, I rewrote the speech a bit, and I asked Lord Alderdice to let me film him presenting this new version in my college in Oxford. We then showed the speech to a large sample of Americans. Half of them were Jewish and were more sympathetic to the Israeli side of the conflict, and half of them were Muslims and more sympathetic to the people of Gaza. What we found was that listening to the speech increased fusion with the out group, with the enemy group, if you like. It also made people more trusting of those on the other side of the conflict, and it made people more open to friendship with them. Even more remarkably, when we repeated these measures with the same participants several days after listening to what was, after all, a very short speech, much of the positive attitude change was still present. In other words, the speech continued to impact people for some time afterwards, making the prospect of openness to peace seemingly more achievable. Fusion can also be used very effectively as a crime prevention strategy. In fact, a similar idea occurred to David Dean, who's one of the founders of the Premier League. David Dean is the creator of what he calls the Twinning Project. It's an initiative aimed at twinning professional football clubs across England and Wales to their local prisons, providing inmates with a chance to bond through their sort of shared love of football. Shortly after announcing the start of this project at Wembley Stadium, he came to visit me and my colleague Martha Newson back home in Oxford, and together we hammered out a plan to carry out research into the effectiveness of this project in reducing reoffending. Martha and I have been studying the effects of the Twinning Project for several years now, and our results are finally starting to come out. What we found is that the more bonded participants become with the Twinning Project, the less trouble they get into in prison, and the healthier and more resilient they become psychologically. We're currently conducting longitudinal studies to see how these positive effects impact the prospects of these ex-prisoners in life after they've been released from prison. In other words, tribalism doesn't have to produce destructive outcomes. It could also be harnessed to make us more cooperative and peaceful and to engage in more sustainable lifestyles. And what's more, it can be scaled up. Briefly to mention a study on this, we investigated the idea of scaling up empirically. Let's say Lucas Reinhardt and I set up an experiment in which participants were shown a video in which the journalist, A.J. Jacobs, explained that all of us are descended from common ancestors, and therefore all human beings constitute one single huge human family. By making our shared biology so salient, this video significantly increased levels of fusion with humanity at large. And that was in comparison with the control condition in which fusion was measured before rather than after watching the video. We've also shown that shared experiences of motherhood increase feelings of fusion towards women in faraway countries. In all of these studies, whether the key factor was shared ancestry or shared self-defining experiences, feelings of shared essence and fusion with other human beings around the world was shown to motivate action as well. And this is really important. In the case of these studies, it was in the form of donations to global charities. So let me just take you back to Papua New Guinea for a moment. One of the most transformative moments in my fieldwork occurred during a really, really bad storm. As many of us huddled together around the fire in the village meeting house, I was told the story of a time when a cyclone struck Queensland in Australia. My friends in the village had been saving up all the money they could raise from selling cash crops with the idea of supporting a community project, maybe a school or an aid post, hadn't been decided. But when they heard of the sufferings of rich Australians across the sea, they decided to give away a huge portion of their savings to provide those people with assistance. And when I tried to dig into why, the best answer I could get was that we're all descended from the same ancestors, which makes all of us family. And helping out is what you do, right, when a family member needs you. Now that we're finally beginning to understand the psychology needed to work together to solve the world's problems, we need to apply that knowledge to the way we do business, to the way we run our countries, and to the way we manage our natural resources. But to achieve this, it's going to take more than a bunch of like-minded academics. It's going to need input from politicians, from religious leaders, from activists coming from all countries, all backgrounds, all age groups, and all cultural groups. However, when it comes to building a better future, arguably the most important people are our children and our grandchildren. They're the ones who are going to take our collective inheritance. They're the ones who need to put it to work. Our ancient ancestors knew this. In many traditional societies, they put young people through initiation rituals to prepare them for taking over the most important roles in society. Hardly any societies do this today, but maybe we should. Imagine if we created a global initiation ritual to support the world's young people as they transition into adulthood. Imagine if such events happened every year. Imagine if millions of 18-year-olds gathered together in cities across hundreds of countries, linked up by live feeds to huge screens, say in sports stadiums or wherever, all around the world. In this way, we could symbolically give birth to global citizens. We could instill the idea of a vast human family to which all of us belong. And we could foster commitment not only to human rights, but to a set of human obligations, universal human obligation, to heal conflicts, to take over stewardship of our planet. I believe there are many other ways in which we could harness human nature more effectively than we do at present. I think we need to take ambitious steps like that if we're to secure a better future for all of us. But it won't be easy. However, I think we could use our collective inheritance to build a more peaceful and a more sustainable world, not only for ourselves, but for all forms of life. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Harvey, por esta interesantísima presentación. Ahora vamos a abrir un espacio para preguntas, comentarios e ideas de nuestro público. Entonces, bueno, mientras no veo ninguna mano levantada todavía, mientras se animan a participar, yo quisiera aprovechar que tengo el micrófono para hacer una pregunta a Harvey. Y tiene que ver con el tema, tal vez, o uno de los más polémicos en nuestro contexto, y es el tema de la religión, ligado a el tema de las identidades y el ejercicio del poder. En mi opinión, la religión tiene como esa doble capacidad de, por un lado, poder unirnos e incluso fusionarnos y hacernos sentir que somos parte de una comunidad de una forma muy íntima, muy personal, muy trascendente, pero también tiene esa capacidad al mismo tiempo de separarnos y de crear grupos enfrentados entre sí. De acuerdo con una investigación hecha acá en la Universidad Nacional, habían dos factores predictores de que la derecha conservadora fuera la que ganara la pasada elección y repitiera en la última elección en febrero pasado. Y esos dos factores eran el conservadurismo moral y la religiosidad, incluso más que la tradicional separación izquierda-derecha en política. Y ciertamente los grupos religiosos, particularmente evangélicos y neopentecostales, han venido involucrándose cada vez más, de forma cada vez más directa en la actividad política, de modo que hoy, por ejemplo, tenemos varios diputados de la República que son también pastores religiosos, de modo tal que se ha acuñado el término políticos religiosos, es decir, que ejercen las dos actividades al mismo tiempo. Entonces, mi pregunta es, vos al inicio decías, Harvey, que la religión puede ser una fuerza positiva y que, al contrario de otros críticos sociales, vos no estarías en la posición de que deberíamos, digamos, eliminarla o quitarla para salir adelante. Pero siendo que en nuestro contexto actual costarricense, latinoamericano e incluso continental, vemos evidencias de cómo la religión se puede convertir en una fuerza muy potente para dividirnos, ¿cómo podríamos hacer para transformarla o convertirla en una fuerza de unidad y de cooperación que nos ayude a crear esa teratribu en la que todos los seres humanos nos podamos ver como una misma comunidad y con un futuro compartido? Entonces, también si alguien más desea preguntar adelante, o damos un espacio a Hart.
Thank you very much, Pablo. If there's one idea I would really hope that all of you would take away from this event, it's the idea that if we accept that the evidence for the existence of a quite rich set of psychological traits that we could call collectively human nature, our evolved psychology, that evolved psychology can be used to drive us into polarization and conflict and all kinds of negative outcomes. But it could also be used to scale up cooperation in ways that produce a more peaceful, harmonious, and sustainable world. That's the central message of the talk. So in answer to that question, I would say this, that, well, specifically, we did a quite interesting study of the polarization of people in another predominantly Catholic country, namely Poland, over the issue of abortion. This is a very, very difficult topic because it polarizes people not only religiously, but politically as well. And I described to you how there are 7 principles of cooperation that are judged morally good everywhere. They're universal. How can it be that people can address a problem like abortion and conclude, even though they share the same basic moral precepts, that their positions on it could be so deeply polarized? And what we found in our survey was that, yes, everybody shared the same 7 moral principles, but they applied them to the problem in different ways. So people on the conservative side of the spectrum who were concerned about, the issue of protection of the unborn fetus, wanted to emphasize things like respect for authority. That was, of course, a code for respect for religious authority and for political authorities. They wanted to emphasize bravery, the courage to stand up to and deal with and tackle the problem of an unwanted child, etc. People on the sort of more liberal end of the spectrum who wanted to champion women's rights were far more interested in loyalty to group, and in this case, a kind of global sisterhood and their rights. So it wasn't that people fundamentally disagreed on the morality, they disagreed on how to apply those moral principles. And this is a good illustration of the point that simply having a universal feature of our psychology does not automatically deliver agreement and consensus. However, in order to do that, I think religion provides us with a set of tools for scaling up our sense of tribalism to be in a way that could be more encompassing. So that, for example, even if we do disagree about how to apply our universal intuitions on morality, we can agree to disagree agreeably, and that we can find solutions together to problems like this, and perhaps even find some kinds of middle ground where our shared moral intuitions could lead us to actually agree on some fundamentals. And this has happened through the mechanism of citizens' assemblies. On the issue of abortion, a very, very difficult issue in another predominantly Catholic country, namely the Republic of Ireland. Citizens' assemblies allowed people an opportunity to really talk through together in person the complicated issues that divide people over the abortion issue. And they came up with a solution that resulted in a degree of consensus, and a referendum which resulted in a change in the law in Ireland, which I think is a really progressive and great example of what can be done.
Gracias. Adelante.
Bueno, buenos días, muchas gracias por la presentación. Me voy a poner aquí como para que me entiendan todos. Yo quería preguntarle al profesor que profundizara un poco más sobre el estudio del análisis del discurso de los líderes autoritarios que nos presentó ahora, porque yo creo que será muy importante que pueda incluir a nuestro expresidente dentro del análisis, porque me parece, y esto es algo que todos lo hemos visto durante todas las conferencias de prensa de nuestro expresidente, él desplegó un discurso autoritario muy, además, ofensivo frente a todo lo que él consideraba que iba en contra de él, todos los miércoles durante 4 años. Y yo tengo la hipótesis de que esa forma en que él nos habló, ese presidente durante este tiempo, naturalizó una forma de hacer política en Costa Rica, de insultar a las personas. Entonces, y creo que eso tiene impactos muy importantes en cómo nosotros los ciudadanos nos relacionamos, pero son solo hipótesis. Entonces me gustaría conocer un poco más sobre este estudio, este análisis que hicieron de los discursos de los presidentes y líderes autoritarios alrededor del mundo, y ojalá que pueda incluir a Costa Rica posteriormente.
I apologize, I didn't find the button. Thank you for that question. The data set on authoritarian leaders is in construction. We haven't done the data analysis yet. However, the goal of that is to analyze huge amounts of verbal productions, written productions on the part of authoritarian leaders, and analyze them for the presence of variables that we think are predictors of violence. That's really the goal of that project. But I think the question you're asking raises a much broader set of questions that may not be answerable strictly on the basis of that research. I think your question is really a bigger question about how we are ourselves influenced in our beliefs and attitudes by the speeches that leaders make, not just authoritarian leaders, but all kinds of leaders. And for me, the really, really big question here relates actually to some different aspects of our research, which have to do with what kinds of groups leaders represent. Do leaders represent are they the sort of like super representatives of their own in-group who advance the interests of, or are perceived as advancing the interests of their own in-group at the expense of all other groups? We could call these barrier-bound leaders, the ones who present themselves as exemplars and heroes, pushing the values, beliefs and interests of a particular sector of society. There are also there's another kind of leader out there that we call barrier crossing leaders. Barrier crossing leaders are ones who appreciate that to solve the big problems of their own in-groups, the best way to do it is to bring on board the out-groups, the competitors, the rivals, and even the enemies of the in-group. Barrier crossers are extraordinary leaders. There are good examples of them on the international scale, but they're not as numerous as barrier-bound leaders. And there's a really big question about why is that? Barrier crossers have the potential to make a much better set of outcomes for all of us, but they are rarer, they are thinner on the ground. And for young people here today who may be thinking in the future of becoming leaders in this country or else in other countries, I really would encourage you to think about the possibility that the prospects of whatever it is you care about are best pursued not simply by pushing forever the agendas of your own in-group at the expense of all other groups, but to consider how your own in-group could benefit from a more careful consideration of how other groups could rise up and improve their lot in a way that actually brings all of us up to a higher level together. There are many examples of the way this can be done, and there are many examples of barrier crossers at a sort of grassroots level in leadership positions. But our institutions seem to weed them out, and they become thinner on the ground the higher you go up in most political hierarchies. And there's a really important question to answer here about why that is. Is it something wrong with the kinds of institutions we have? Why do they select for barrier-bound leaders at the expense of barrier crossers? And how can we foster more barrier crossers?
Ok, tenemos una pregunta por allá, pero antes de dar la palabra, quisiera invitar muy cariñosamente a que tal vez un o una estudiante del humanístico o un y una estudiante, allá la tenemos, del europeo, se animaran a hacernos una pregunta. Excelente, súper. Entonces, ¿qué les parece si hacemos un set de preguntas? ¿Estarías de acuerdo en hacer un conjunto de varias preguntas? Y el compañero tal vez nos pueda ayudar. Empezamos por allá, luego seguimos por acá y luego por allá. Sí, sí.
Hola. Bueno, yo tengo una pregunta como acerca de la parte del tribalismo que nos estaba comentando, porque entiendo que como sociedad aprendimos a estar en grupo para sobrevivir. Bueno, ya que había que formar parte de una tribu para saber cómo sobrevivir, qué comer, qué no comer y con quién no estar. Pero ahora como sociedad más avanzada sabemos que esto no es necesario para nuestra sobrevivencia. Entonces, bueno, ya que ahora sabemos que el instinto de ser parte de un grupo o de una tribu no es necesario, ¿por qué seguimos como sociedad siendo parte de un grupo y hasta fusionando nuestras personalidades a algo que nos pueden hacer daño, como por ejemplo el ser parte eh, de una milicia, de un ejército que podría poner en riesgo mi propia vida solamente por ser parte de esto? O como por ejemplo los grupos de algún deporte, de fútbol. O sea, tal vez yo no sé mucho de fútbol o no me gusta tanto mi equipo, pero solo por ser de Costa Rica, yo ya soy de la Sele de Costa Rica. ¿Por qué como sociedad seguimos con este instinto tan fuerte y seguimos prevaleciéndolo cuando no es necesario para nosotros? Tipo, ¿hay alguna razón como más allá de por lo que empezó que nos haga ser parte de este comportamiento? Por el
Si gusta, recolectamos tal vez dos preguntas por acá y dos preguntas por allá.
Bueno, buenos días. Mi pregunta va más hacia cuando usted hablaba de ética y de moral. Lo que yo quisiera saber es si usted cree que la empatía es algo con lo que el ser humano nace y el que no nació con eso no la tiene, o es algo que todos los seres humanos aprendemos y simplemente hay gente que no lo logró aprender.
Bueno, primero que todo, muchas gracias. Y la pregunta es más que todo con lo que se dijo de Papúa Nueva Guinea, que lo aceptaron y le enseñaron el idioma que no es un idioma escrito. Entonces, que si podría más o menos contarnos de ese proceso y pues hablarnos un poco en eso.
Buenos días. Siento que últimamente en la sociedad siempre, bueno, está dicho que como tribu, bueno, como personas somos seres sociales y que tuvimos que juntarnos en tribus para poder sobrevivir. He notado que últimamente, bueno, sobre todo en base al modelo capitalista, eh, ¿sí? Hemos tenido ideas de que mucho del individualismo antes que lo colectivo, ¿ve? cómo estas ideas nos afectan a nosotros hoy en día y nos pueden afectar hacia el futuro. Muchas gracias.
Mi pregunta recae sobre quién define sobre los patrones sociales, es decir, más del conjunto de la comunidad, quién es como el que primero que definió eso, para establecer como los rituales y todo lo relacionado con ellos.
Una pregunta más por acá y hacemos una pausa, damos espacio a Harvey y luego recolectamos las del otro sector.
Con respecto a eso, mi pregunta sería, ¿cómo es que esto mismo influye dentro de las sociedades, digamos? ¿Quién es el que nos hace a nosotros mismos pensar así? Porque con respecto a las preguntas que hicieron los compañeros anteriormente, para mí también eso tiene una influencia, una razón de ser, en donde algún tipo de élite o algún tipo de grupo específico utiliza ese sentimiento de pertenencia primitivo, o bueno, no primitivo, sino asociado a la humanidad desde años anteriores para su propio beneficio. Entonces, ¿cuál sería ese grupo? Y si tiene algún tipo de relación con los regímenes autoritarios que hablamos anteriormente.
Fine. Well, thank you for those very interesting questions. There were 6 of them, and they were all big, like huge questions. So, you know, I'll try to be really concise in answering each of them in turn. The first question was really about how come we still act and think in such tribalistic ways if this isn't essential for our survival anymore? I suppose there is a question there about whether it still serves some of the same functions for which it originally evolved, and I think the answer is yes. But it's also the case that some forms of tribalism are deeply dysfunctional now, and so we need to think carefully about how that tribalism is applied. Very briefly, one of the most disparaging or one of the most disappointing discoveries of our analysis of global history using this vast SEISHAT database is that there are 2 main drivers of the rise of social complexity around the world. One of them is agriculture. That's not too shocking, but the really shocking one, and the one I find quite difficult to reconcile to myself, but it's the data are very clear on this, is warfare, or at least military technology as a proxy for warfare. And you can see that whenever killing machines get more lethal at various points in history, social complexity increases as a consequence of that. So it's been a driver of how civilizations have got bigger and bigger. And that, of course, is intimately related to tribalism. However, we now live in a world where the lethality of our weaponry is so extreme that it presents an existential threat to all of us. And so the logic that has driven the rise of civilizations cannot be the logic that drives us into the future. That means we really need to rethink how we manage our natural tribalism. Okay, I'll try and be really briefer about some of these, but they are all really big questions. The second question was about empathy, which isn't necessarily, that we shouldn't confuse this with morality, but empathy or perspective taking and understanding other people's mental states and feelings. Does that vary across individuals? For sure. It also varies quite dramatically across genders, across sexes, I should say. At a population level, women are better at empathizing than men, and there's a lot of good evidence for that. It doesn't mean necessarily that men are therefore less capable of being moral. It's a long and complicated one, this, but being compassionate and kind is not the only set of tools that you need to be a moral person. So the fact that naturally men tend to have more systemizing than empathizing kinds of minds should not prevent men from being capable of being as moral as women, in theory at least. I was asked about Papua New Guinea, and I won't tell an additional long story about my field work there, but I would just like to say one thing that impacted me enormously, which was my experience of being initiated into that group. I was very young, I was in my early 20s, so I was kind of just turning into an adult, and I was taken by mentors, older men, more experienced, more knowledgeable men, and put through these initiation rituals. And my job as an anthropologist was to observe and participate and understand from within. But it was also impactful for me personally, and it's left me with a sort of permanent sense of having been transformed by something quite important. And that's why I think all of us who haven't had that experience are being denied something really important. And I'm very curious, since we have quite a lot of people here, am I right in saying that not everyone here is over 18? Am I right in thinking not everyone in this room is over 18 years of age? So I would love to know from those of you who are not yet 18, whether you would consider it an interesting prospect to undergo an initiation ritual, perhaps being initiated into some kind of global citizenhood. So I'd love to know what you think about that. Does capitalism make us more individualistic? In some ways, I think it does. It's a bit more complex than that because there are whole regions of the world. East Asia, for example, is less individualistic by some measures, despite being very good at capitalism. And there are other interesting differences. There's much lower openness to joining new groups throughout East Asia than there is in certain parts of the Western world, particularly, and there's a difference between urban and rural environments on that parameter as well. Why am I saying this? I guess what I'm saying is that how we relate to our fellow human beings is not just a product of what kind of economic system we have and whether we pursue profit or wealth production as the most important thing to do. I think it affects it, but it's not the only factor. I think it's possible to live within a broadly capitalist system without losing touch with the importance of things that are much bigger than just our individual personal selfish wants and needs. So I think they're not irreconcilable, those two ideas. Who gets to decide how our societies are organized? No one really, because societies evolve through a process of cultural evolution in which many, many people have a shaping and constraining effect on how institutions unfold. Of course, we celebrate among our ancestors, the great heroes who are attributed very important roles in shaping our institutions. And we live in an era in which many of those, and not just in our era, but throughout the past, some of those heroes have been, their statues or the equivalent have been pulled down, and the monuments they created pulled down as we come to take a more negative view of their accomplishments. But the truth is, all of those ideas are a little bit, tend to exaggerate how individuals have shaped our past societies. The truth is that our societies have been shaped by a huge number of very complex processes of negotiation. And what we really need to understand is the deeper forces underlying that. That's a big topic, which I won't try and get into right now. And then the last question was about who makes us think a certain way. Again, I wouldn't put it down to individuals, but I have a big concern about the way the media, including social media, shape the way we think nowadays. And one of the most important pieces of advice I could possibly give to young people would be to look at it with a certain amount of caution, because by having our thoughts and ideas corralled in a way that, for example, makes us very focused on particularly very negative things. There's a sort of bad is better than good psychology that is being exploited here. We tend to have a more negative and sometimes very sort of apocalyptic kind of view of the future, and a sense of the present being a deeply sort of corrosive and unpleasant place in which we can't trust our leaders, in which our institutions are failing us, and so on. And we think that crime is getting worse often when it isn't. We think lots of negative things are happening because they are so exaggerated by the media. And it's not because the media are evil and would like to sell us something to make us more anxious and miserable. They're doing it because algorithms, sort of have been developed to make us buy more products. It's a very good strategy commercially to get people to click on things that they find disturbing and upsetting, because it sells us products. So the question is, do we regulate that? Do we educate ourselves better? Well, I suppose both of those things, if we can. The regulation of social media is becoming harder and harder to do in the current climate. But there is a third thing that we can do, which is try and develop algorithms that are both commercially successful, but also psychologically healthier. And that's something that I think we should focus attention on. Oops.
Thank you, Harvey. Okay, we have a set of questions from the blue side. So, can you help us? Perdón, ¿nos puede ayudar para las preguntas que tenemos de este lado? Disculpen.
Well, I first want to say that I think it's really amazing how, while you were being a professor at the Oxford University, you were also able to travel the world and do all of these investigations. That kind of connects to my question. That's how, or from doing all of these surveys and researching and gathering all that information, while traveling through those places, where do you think was a moment or the place where you saw most of a difference, how you were raised and how you view the world differently?
I think there are more. Perdón, creo que hay más preguntas de este lado. Okay.
Okay, so you were talking about how often bad or negative events can join us together and make us feel as if we're one group. And I wanted to know if maybe it is possible that sometimes positive events can do the same, and if they could have such a big, like, the same amount of effect as a negative event could. And additionally, I would like to ask about how those different moral kind of aspects can reign over one another, because you can, like, why is something that is so positive as a family and is based on love and care, how is it that something like violent and a violent event can reign over it? Where is that decided? And how is it that in these different cultures around the world, it is so different, and yet these moral bases remain the same?
Okay, one last question. Okay, we have one in the front.
My question is more about the process than the discussion. I was really interested also in the service, as my classmate said. How do you get the data, like a solid conclusion? Like, for example, we did a survey a few months ago. We did a survey, and in my group research and like question and conclusion, it was a little like confusing, since we asked people from different ages, people with different perspectives. How do you get like that solid like conclusion, asking like people with that same, like almost same age, people of like same region, like, and like, for example, in like religion, in my opinion, I would think more like the thing of family and friends, of like the choosing. I would think probably depending on your age, you could choose, or like their family or friends. So yeah, how do you get like that solid conclusion?
Okay, and we have okay, 3 more questions. 1, 2, and 3. Okay.
I was wondering how, or like, why is it that we look so much for that us versus them mentality to like identify groups? Because I was thinking, like, for example, when you think like you belong somewhere, like maybe your country or something like that, I was wondering, like, how does that work? Because for the whole like Terra tribal like thing, it's kind of hard to imagine like everyone together as a group, in the sense that I feel like, why is it that we lean so much towards that division, right? Why do we need that in order to identify with a group? And when we're outside of that, and when we don't like conform with it, why is that so hard?
I had a question that was, how do we make this idea about fusion work in a society that is separating little by little each day?
I was wondering more about how, like, what you think about our institutions as of today. Like, should we include different type of like classes or programs to make sure that we aren't like biased in these ways, or are we okay as we are?
Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, this is the last set of answers because of the time.
Yes, I understand. Again, it's a very, very long list of questions, and can I take some of these questions together because they overlap to some extent? I mean, one of the things that I often get asked, and I feel it's implicit in some of these questions, is surely feeling unified with an us automatically makes us feel competitive, rivalrous, even hostile towards a them. That is us them thinking something just inescapable, that is part and parcel of the way we think, that as soon as we think in a tribal way, we automatically denigrate, derogate, downgrade the outgroup. And the answer to that, I think, is no, because, and the reason I say no is because so much of our thinking is dominated by the world of social identity theory. And there's a good reason why that is. We live in societies in which group categories matter enormously to us. And group categories are often associated with this process of identification, in which to be part of a group is to wear the same identity markers as other group members. And we can wear them in lots of ways. They don't necessarily have to be visible on our person. I mean, a very salient example of it in this room is that a lot of people have blue tops on, which identifies them as members of the same institution, I assume. But when you wear identity markers or subscribe to beliefs that are associated with a particular group or institution, you are very aware of the fact that those identity markers were not your own creation. They were provided to you by the group. You got born into it, if you like, rather than creating it yourself. And in that sense, the group transcends you. Actually, it transcends you in several ways. It'll, presumably with very stable groups, they'll still be around long after you've left them. And other people will be wearing blue shirts even after you cease to wear them. And so that kind of identity is associated with identifying with a group, but it's not the kind of identity that taps into your sense of personal self, your sense of who you are as a unique person. And that process of identification, as I mentioned in the talk, is depersonalizing. But there's another aspect to it, which is that it automatically makes you look a little bit competitively in the direction of people who wear red shirts or yellow shirts. If you were to bring people into this room right now who wore a different color shirt, it would naturally trigger a sense of slightly parochial attitudes, favoring your in-group in your attitudes towards that potential out-group. It would be mild, like I don't imagine you'd want to attack those people, but there is an automatic sense of competitiveness that's activated in that way. With this fusion construct, which produces a much stronger sense of commitment to the group, that isn't present. Fusion, the most common target for fusion around the world is family. And you don't have to hate or dislike other families to love your family. However, it is possible to scale up that feeling of familial connection to much, much larger groups. Some people are really fused with their countries. But again, very often when that happens, there's also a strong, it's highly correlated with identification with country and is often associated with some kind of outgroup threat to your country. So, you know, when your group is threatened, when your country goes to war, fusion levels tend to increase. So fusion can become confused and sort of muddled up with and entangled with outgroup hostility. I think the only solution to this, the only enduring solution, is to respect all the different kinds of groups we already belong to, not challenge any of that, no matter how parochial, unless those groups are doing serious harm, but to be as tolerant as possible of all the different kinds of groups that people align with. But to create, in addition to all of that, a superordinate identity, something bigger than all of them, that unifies all of us as a single species. Actually, I think we could even go beyond that and try and fuse with other species as well and see ourselves as just one form of life, but to feel a sense of familial and ancestral connection to all forms of life, which is essentially what the theory of biological evolution provides us with a sanction for. We really are all descended from common ancestors as all forms of life. Interestingly, meditators have this visceral feeling of being, sharing common essence with all forms of life, and are more likely to give money to charities involved in conservation or caring for other forms of life on Earth. But that kind of psychology is within reach of all of us, whether or not we meditate. It's in reach of all of us, whether or not we happen to have more parochial commitments to football teams or to countries or to religions. But it's a very neglected area of human psychology. It's not something that we put a lot of energy and effort into. And to do that, we need the right kind of leadership, the right kinds of education, and the right kinds of institutional supports. And to go back to the question, who decides? We all get to decide that. That's something that we can choose together. Anyway, maybe I'll stop there, but thank you all for the fantastic questions. I really appreciated that.
Well, just as a final gift, I brought something to you. Do you like coffee, by the way? Oh, great. Because do you know that Costa Rica has one of the best coffees in the world? Tarrazú coffee. Have you tried that? Thank you very much. Once again, please give an applause to Herbie. Y muchas gracias a todas y todos por acompañarnos y por sus fabulosas preguntas. Sigan así, sigan pensando y creo que así podemos construir de verdad que un mundo mejor. Gracias de verdad. Buen día.